Hi, this is the AI Storyteller. I'm Mark. The book I will interpret for you today is the classic literary masterpiece Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind is one of the best-selling novels in American history, with a circulation of over 30 million copies. It remains a beloved literary work among Americans to this day. In its first year of publication in 1936, the novel sold 1 million copies, a remarkable achievement even by today's standards. This is particularly impressive considering that it was released during the Great Depression in the United States. Although the timeline of Gone with the Wind is not extensive, the content it encompasses is exceptionally rich. The story primarily takes place during the American Civil War and the Reconstruction era that followed. The novel portrays hundreds of characters and several plantation families, resulting in complex relationships and intertwining storylines. In this analysis, we will divide it into two parts. The first part will introduce the author's life and the historical background of the novel's creation, as well as summarize the plot. In the second part, in addition to concluding the story, we will analyze the four main characters, Scarlett, Rhett, Ashley, and Melanie, examining their patterns of love, trajectories of fate, and personality traits. We will explore how Gone with the Wind serves as a successful example, breaking the limitations of popular novels in terms of character development and narrative style, becoming an enduring global classic. Before 1939, Gone with the Wind was primarily a phenomenon within the United States. However, with the successful film adaptation by Selznick International Pictures in 1939, Vivien Leigh's stunning beauty and Clark Gable's charismatic mustache left an indelible visual impression on audiences worldwide. The film won 10 Academy Awards at the 1940 Oscars and grossed an astonishing $1.6 billion. Taking inflation into account, the box office record set by Gone with the Wind remains unbeatable to this day. From then on, the influence of the novel and the film became inseparable. In fact, Gone with the Wind is a difficult novel to categorize, as it combines multiple genres. Firstly, it is a romantic love story. The turbulent and passionate love triangle between Scarlett, Rhett, and Ashley undoubtedly served as a blueprint for numerous subsequent love stories. Secondly, it is a typical historical novel. The novel depicts the collapse of the economic, political, and cultural traditions of the American South during the Civil War. It allows us to understand the historical context and social structure of the South at that time. In terms of its capacity and density, it indeed possesses encyclopedic ambitions. Finally, the protagonist Scarlett experiences war, poverty, and emotional turmoil, gradually maturing both physically and mentally. Her awakening to female autonomy and self-awareness represents the aspirations of women seeking independence and self-worth after the war. Therefore, it is entirely justified to consider it a coming-of-age novel for women. In summary, Gone with the Wind draws from various genres but is not limited by them. Its unique charm and epic qualities rival those of other renowned works in the literary canon. Part 1. The female author who created this remarkable work is named Margaret Mitchell. If you just have a brief understanding of Mitchell's life, you will find that she seems to have been born to write Gone with the Wind. This is her only work, which has earned her a place in history. After the tremendous success of Gone with the Wind, she never picked up her pen again. Unfortunately, more than 10 years later, Mitchell died in a car accident. Let's take a look at the general trajectory of Mitchell's short life. She was born in Atlanta in 1900, and the most significant war scenes in the novel take place in Atlanta. Imagine a map of the United States. Georgia is located in the southeastern part, and its capital, Atlanta, is the northernmost city in the state and serves as a major railway hub for the entire South. Therefore, Atlanta faced the Northern Army head-on during the Civil War, enduring the ravages of war and almost being reduced to ashes. This corresponds to the description in the novel when Scarlett experiences the siege of Atlanta. Mitchell's ancestors had lived in Atlanta for 4 generations, and her grandfather had been wounded in the war. Many of her elders had first-hand experiences of the war, and often shared their sealed memories with her. From 1922 to 1926, Mitchell worked as a columnist and journalist for the Atlanta Sunday paper. During this period, she accumulated a wealth of historical and everyday life materials until she later resigned and stayed home to recuperate. It was during her illness that, encouraged by her second husband, Mitchell began her 10-year-long creative journey. It is evident that before starting her writing, Mitchell had gained a thorough understanding of the history of the American Civil War through first-hand accounts from family members and material accumulation, both emotionally and intellectually. We all know that the American Civil War is commonly referred to as the Civil War, and related themes have always been a hot topic in American literature. When it comes to Civil War themes, another prominent female author and her famous anti-slavery novel published in the 19th century often come up in comparison with Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. That author is Harriet Beecher Stowe and her work, Uncle Tom's Cabin. This influential novel was even praised by Lincoln as the little woman who started this big war, indicating that its political significance may, in some ways, have surpassed its literary status. How should we view the relationship between these two works, which are separated by nearly a century, have similar themes, but different attitudes? Both novels are connected to slavery and extensively depict the plight of enslaved individuals. Uncle Tom's Cabin portrays the tragic experiences of enslaved people as Harriet Beecher Stowe, a staunch abolitionist, takes a thoroughly critical and condemnatory stance against the cruel institution of slavery. Stowe's Northern Puritan background is clearly evident in the novel, and she firmly believes that slavery and Christianity are fundamentally irreconcilable. On the other hand, Margaret Mitchell was a true Southerner, and Gone with the Wind is a novel that presents the transformation of the American South from the perspective of Southern people during the backdrop of the Civil War. Mitchell, with her Southern heritage flowing through her veins, holds a moderate and nostalgic attitude towards Southern culture. Although Mitchell laments the irreversible decline of Southern culture, she also understands that it is an inevitable trend. The plantation owners in Gone with the Wind treat their enslaved individuals with moderation and restraint, and there are even several black characters depicted as dignified and respected, surpassing some of the white characters. Ethically and morally, Gone with the Wind presents a stark contrast to Uncle Tom's Cabin, making it fascinating to read both works side by side. Now let's return to the novel Gone with the Wind. From a storytelling perspective, it is an outstanding work with evident strengths: a complex and touching love story, grand and realistic war scenes, vivid and distinct character portrayals, intricate and winding character destinies, and an open-ended ending that keeps readers engrossed. Therefore, regardless of the author's historical perspectives, complex personal background, or potential criticisms of glorifying slavery and distorting the nature of the Civil War, the allure of Gone with the Wind remains undiminished in the hearts of ordinary readers. Now let's follow the story of Gone with the Wind and see how these characters intertwine their destinies amidst the raging war. The novel begins by providing the precise time and location of the story: April 1861 in Georgia. Anyone with a basic knowledge of American history would immediately recognize that 1861 was the year the American Civil War broke out. And Georgia was one of the 7 states that seceded from the Union and joined the Confederate States of America. At this point, we need to look at the historical reasons behind the outbreak of the Civil War because it is the sole external condition that influences the trajectory of the entire novel. The Civil War in the United States lasted from 1861 to 1865, with the Confederate government in the South and the Union government in the North as the two opposing forces. The division between the North and the South had deep roots dating back to the early days of the country, and the economic system contradictions between the two regions were particularly severe. The differences in economic ideologies ultimately manifested in the issue of slavery, whether the ancient institution of slavery should be abolished or maintained. The northern United States was primarily driven by manufacturing, commerce, and finance, while the South relied heavily on plantation economies. The plantations depicted in Gone with the Wind, such as Tara and 12 Oaks, are medium-sized plantations in Georgia that own vast amounts of land and had over 100 enslaved individuals, yielding significant cotton production each year. Cotton is also a crucial element in the novel Gone with the Wind and symbolizes the wealth of the plantations. Even during the post-war Reconstruction period, when the Union Army burned all the cotton at Tara Plantation, Scarlet, in her efforts to revive her family, immediately thinks of planting cotton. Ultimately, why did Southerners hold on to slavery? Because once cotton was planted, it needed someone to pick it, and once picked, it had to be transported to the North for sale and profit. Therefore, in an era before the widespread use of cotton gins, enslaved individuals became the sole labor force for picking cotton. This was the primary reason why the Southern states were determined to defend the institution of slavery. Before the novel's main character makes her formal appearance, the shadow of the Civil War had already engulfed the South. On a sunny afternoon, Scarlett O'Hara was casually chatting with her suitors, the Tarleton brothers. Don't assume that the subsequent dialogue is merely playful banter between young men and women. In Gone with the Wind, a significant amount of dialogue serves an essential purpose. It reflects character traits, propels the plot, and contains a wealth of information about the historical background and social changes in its casual conversations. Its density and ambition exceed that of typical novels. The conversation between Scarlett and the Tarleton brothers skillfully reveals that the spark of the Civil War has already been ignited, while the conversation between the Tarleton brothers introduces the class structure within Clayton County. The O'Hara family and their neighbors, the Tarletons, undoubtedly represent the large plantation owners in the county. Scarlett's father, Gerald O'Hara, is an Irish immigrant who came to Georgia with a fervent love for land. Through gambling, he won ownership of Tara Plantation, prospered, and integrated into the local social circle. The Tarletons, on the other hand, possess land, enslaved individuals, cotton fields, pastures, and more. They have no worries about their livelihoods and occupy the top of the Southern social hierarchy. That's why the Tarleton brothers are idle and do not engage in meaningful work. The mention of Ashley Wilkes, a typical poor white, reflects the lower class in society. They have at most 4 enslaved individuals and are even looked down upon by the Tarletons. These people live at the bottom of Southern society. Between the large plantation owners and the poor whites, there are also small farmers or yeomen who cultivate their own land. In fact, these people also support maintaining the institution of slavery because they fear that once enslaved individuals are emancipated, they will compete for land. Moreover, the existing system of slavery elevates the social status of yeomen and poor whites. Our leading lady, Scarlett, is the eldest daughter of Gerald O'Hara and the belle of Tara Plantation. The beginning of the novel also describes Scarlett's appearance. She is 16 years old, with a slender waist and a full figure. The book states that Scarlett is not conventionally beautiful. Clearly, the film adaptation did not fully adhere to the novel's description when selecting the leading actress. However, Scarlett's charm is undeniable, as all the young gentlemen in Clayton County are captivated by her. Her mother and Mammy, the enslaved woman who cares for her, always wanted to raise Scarlett as a gentle and virtuous lady, but their efforts were in vain. Scarlett's temperament goes against the typical Southern belle. Despite her outward elegance, she cannot hide her inherently headstrong, willful, and lively nature. Speaking of Mammy, she is an important character in the novel, Gone with the Wind, and serves as Scarlett's guardian, witnessing the rise and fall of Tara Plantation. She is not an ordinary slave. She holds a significant position at Tara and became the housekeeper and overseer of household affairs after accompanying Scarlett's mother as a wedding gift to the plantation. Mammy has a high opinion of herself and even holds higher moral standards than some white people. Due to her special affection for Scarlett, she exercises strict control over her, displaying a typical tough exterior with a soft heart. As more characters are introduced in the novel, we can observe that the slaves on the plantation can be divided into 2 categories. One type is house slaves who serve the masters indoors or perform various household tasks, such as trusted servants like Mammy and Pork, who hold a higher status. The other type is field slaves who engage in agricultural production and hold the lowest position on the plantation. Typically, the plantation owners do not personally supervise their work in the fields, but instead hire a white overseer for that role. Although there are differences in status between the 2 types of slaves, according to the novel, any respectable plantation owner and their family members would not mistreat the slaves. This was an unwritten rule among Southern plantation families. Scarlett's mother, being of French noble descent, is a typical Southern belle, elegant in demeanor and kind-hearted. She repeatedly teaches Scarlett, treat those of lower status, especially black people, with both firmness and kindness. As for Scarlett's straightforward father, Gerald, he is quite generous towards his loyal slave, Pork. He even spends a considerable amount of money to buy back Pork's wife and daughter from a neighboring plantation, reuniting their family. The author even humorously describes how Gerald occasionally gets bullied by the black slaves in his household. The harmonious scenes depicted in the novel before the war seem like a completely different world from the tragic reality of the slaves suffering from whippings and separation from their families portrayed by Mrs. Stowe. Now, let's talk about how Scarlett learns a shocking piece of news from the Tarleton brothers that leaves her deeply shaken. The person she admired, Ashley Wilkes, is soon to be engaged to his cousin, Melanie, whom Scarlett considers ordinary and frail. This revelation is like a bolt from the blue for Scarlett. She becomes instantly conflicted and overwhelmed. Before hearing this news, she had always assumed that Ashley would propose to her. However, our protagonist, Scarlett O'Hara, quickly demonstrates her stubborn and indomitable nature. She refuses to accept defeat so easily and immediately decides to use every means at her disposal to win back Ashley's heart at the upcoming barbecue picnic the next day. It is from this day onwards that Scarlett embarks on a relentless pursuit of Ashley, which marks the beginning of a lifetime of emotional turmoil for her. The barbecue picnic at 12 Oaks Plantation was held in a grand and extravagant manner, showcasing the social customs of the Southern society at that time. Scarlett stood out at the picnic, doing everything possible to capture Ashley's attention, but unfortunately, her efforts were in vain. Just when we were anxious and impatient, Scarlett finally found an opportunity to confess her true feelings to Ashley. Ashley admitted that he had feelings for Scarlett but clearly rejected her. He knew full well that their interests and desires were different. Scarlett wanted all of him, including his body, mind, and soul, but Ashley couldn't give her that. Ashley's ruthless rejection infuriated Scarlett, and in her anger, she smashed some china, only to discover that Rhett Butler had been eavesdropping from the sofa all along. Our leading male character makes his entrance. Who is Rhett Butler? He is a notorious rogue, a businessman who scoffs at the impractical Southern attitude towards the war. He has a bad reputation, and respectable ladies avoid him like the plague. Scarlett is horrified to realize that her innermost secret has been overheard by this rude and uncouth fellow, leaving her in a state of embarrassment. However, Rhett Butler has a smiling expression on his face and greatly admires this fierce and passionate girl standing before him. And so, the first direct confrontation between Scarlett and Butler, this pair of contradictory yet infatuated adversaries, takes place in an atmosphere of awkwardness after Scarlett's rejected confession. We all know that two people who initially can't stand each other at first sight often end up experiencing something between them later on. Just think about Pride and Prejudice to understand this. The brilliance of the author lies in the fact that instead of describing the development of Scarlett and Butler's relationship in the subsequent plot, a quick wave of the pen signals the onset of the Civil War, swiftly propelling the story to the next stage. Only the seeds of affection and misunderstandings planted when the two main characters first met are left, leaving readers with boundless imagination about their future. The gathering at 12 Oaks Plantation is not yet over when the Civil War erupts. Unexpectedly, Scarlett hastily accepts the marriage proposal from Melanie's brother, Charles. In other words, Scarlett marries the younger brother of her love rival, an act filled with revenge. Ashley is well aware of the revengeful implications, but kind-hearted Melanie remains completely oblivious. After their marriage, both Charles and Ashley go off to fight for the country. However, fate plays a cruel joke on Scarlett. Less than 2 months into the war, Charles dies of pneumonia on the battlefield, leaving Scarlett with the title of a widow and a child from their brief union. From then on, she is forced to wear somber black clothing every day, restrain her words and actions, and is completely cut off from social gatherings. It is only at this moment that Scarlett regrets her impulsive and reckless decision. There was no love between her and Charles. The marriage was solely for revenge against Ashley. When Scarlett was in a state of constant distress, Charles's aunt, Pitty, wrote a letter inviting Scarlett to stay in Atlanta, accompanying her and Melanie. Although Scarlett despised Melanie from the bottom of her heart, the thought of being able to learn news about Ashley made her go to Atlanta without hesitation. There, she fully experienced the difference between this city and others. After all, Atlanta was the birthplace of the author, who dedicated extensive descriptions to its rise. Atlanta prospered through the railroad, starting from one railroad and gradually becoming a hub for Southern railways, developing into a prosperous small city with over 10,000 residents. It was a mixture of old and new in Georgia, a place where new and old clashed, with the new often prevailing. The author arranged for Scarlett to leave Terra Plantation and come to Atlanta with a purpose. Soon, Scarlett regained her spirits and felt as if she had been reborn in Atlanta. She worked alongside Melanie in a hospital in the rear, contributing to the Confederate government. Spending time together day and night, Scarlett and Melanie grew closer, and Scarlett began to understand what kind of person Ashley's wife, Melanie, was: shy, simple, kind, and genuine. Melanie's virtues naturally radiated and influenced those around her, making everyone like her and revolve around her. Scarlett understood that Melanie was different from herself. She lacked the selfishness and pettiness that capture men's hearts. Her kindness and thoughtfulness came from the heart, and Melanie always stood by Scarlett's side, even in times of adversity when others turned against her. Among the many female characters portrayed in Gone with the Wind, Scarlett was brave, tenacious, and outspoken. She dared to love and hate, like a beautiful and thorny rose, possessing a vibrant vitality that enabled her to survive in harsh environments. On the other hand, Melanie was not a supporting role. She seemed ordinary and not eloquent, but she had her unique philosophy of life and was unwavering. In certain crucial moments, she displayed even greater courage and strength than Scarlett, even earning the respect of the proud Butler. Just when we wondered why there was no follow-up between Butler and Scarlett, the author promptly arranged for them to meet again at a charity bazaar, Butler's first appearance after the war began. At this time, he had become a businessman who traversed the blockade, making a fortune from the war. However, this encounter happened once again in an awkward atmosphere. Scarlett, dressed as a widow, watched enviously as the other ladies danced and flaunted their brightly colored dresses at the bazaar, only to be bumped into by Butler. Butler saw through Scarlett's thoughts and sarcastically remarked, showing no trace of the elegance of a Southern gentleman, which infuriated Scarlett. But Butler always acted unexpectedly. He generously donated $150 gold and invited Scarlett to dance, causing a commotion in the entire hall. It was already a flamboyant act for a notorious businessman to invite a widow to dance, and Scarlett's response of "I would be delighted" left the moralists in the room dumbfounded. It must be said that this scene was filled with a highly romanticized sentiment. Influenced by the conservative customs of the South, Scarlett, as a young widow, should have been confined to her home. Stepping out and making an appearance was already an act of defiance, let alone dancing, which was considered a grave offense. However, Scarlett did it anyway. It was the first time the rebellious protagonists resonated with each other in spirit and personality. From that point on, we would discover that the similarities between Scarlett and Butler only grew stronger in the subsequent plot. While Scarlett had more and more contact with Rhett Butler during the war, she did not forget about Ashley. Ashley returned to Atlanta on leave, and their brief reunion stirred up Scarlett's admiration once again. When bidding farewell to Ashley, Scarlett once again confessed her true feelings. Unfortunately, Ashley still rejected Scarlett's love, shattering her hopes once more. In 1864, Atlanta was besieged on three sides by Union forces and became an isolated island. A large number of wounded Confederate soldiers poured into the city. To make matters worse, on the day the city was breached, Melanie was about to give birth, and all the doctors were busy caring for the wounded. Scarlett had no one to rely on. Her parents, Mammy, and Tara were all miles away. It seemed as if her pleas to heaven and earth went unanswered. The defeated Confederate army set fires within the city, attempting to destroy supplies, and Atlanta ultimately fell into the hands of the Union Army. In a moment of crisis, Scarlett's courage triumphed over fear. She calmly assisted Melanie in giving birth and sent a servant to seek help from Rhett Butler. At this critical moment, we finally witness the arrival of a knight in shining armor. This hero, although usually reckless and unruly, proved reliable in times of need. Until now, Scarlet hadn't realized that, despite always finding fault with Rhett, she had subconsciously started to rely on him. The fluctuating and elusive nature of their relationship had yet to ignite a true spark, leaving readers with a suspenseful anticipation, skillfully crafted by the author in the first half of the novel. On the journey back to Terra, as Scarlet and her companions were being escorted, Rhett suddenly changed his mind and decided to return to enlist in the Confederate Army. Despite his typically carefree demeanor and his foreknowledge that the war would inevitably end in the South's defeat, as a Southerner, Rhett felt compelled to contribute his loyalty during the South's most challenging time. Each choice made by this character in the novel was almost always unexpected, and this contributed to his uniquely captivating charm. Of course, the most unexpected of all was Scarlet, who had just started to develop a favorable opinion of him. Once again, Scarlet found herself in a helpless and isolated predicament. However, this remarkable Southern woman once again displayed astonishing courage and determination. She single-handedly drove a carriage, taking Melanie, her child, and the house servant, and braved the gunfire as she broke through the Union blockade, finally returning to her hometown. While Terra was not burned down, the situation could not have been worse. Her mother died of typhoid fever, her father was mentally unstable, her two sisters were unconscious due to typhoid, and all the slaves, except for Mammy and Pork, had been emancipated. The Yankees had burned all the cotton and looted all the food and valuables. At this moment, Terra was stripped of its former prosperity and beauty, reduced to destitution. Scarlet swore to herself that she would revive Terra and never experience the agony of hunger again. At this moment, a qualitative transformation took place within Scarlet's heart, as the elements stirred by adversity, whether it be female consciousness or survival instinct, began to shine. She quickly adapted to the current circumstances, shedding her aristocratic delicacy and becoming pragmatic and ruthless. She personally led the people of Terra in their labor, protecting her family. It was the war, hunger, and poverty that brought about this transformation. Compared to those Southerners who indulged in the past and faltered after the upheaval, Scarlet was destined to stand out and inevitably attract controversy. Finally, the war came to an end, and everything was gradually improving. The final cliffhanger set in the first part of the novel was Ashley's return. Would Scarlet end up with Ashley? What fate awaited Rhett Butler after joining the army? Could Terra Estate regain its former glory? All these unresolved questions await answers in the second part of the novel. That concludes the first part. In the commentary of the second part, we will fully interpret the final destinies of several main characters and the intricate path of their love, as well as supplement the changes in the post-war Southern social environment and the impact of defeat on the mentality of Southerners. We will also compare the interesting similarities and differences between the plot of Gone with the Wind in both the film and the novel. Now, let's review the key points covered in the first part. First, Margaret Mitchell, a female writer with a deep Southern sentiment, dedicated her life to creating her only work, Gone with the Wind, which became an enduring masterpiece breaking through the realm of popular fiction. The film adaptation of the same name in 1937, starring Vivien Leigh and Clark Gable, also became one of the most successful remakes in film history. Second, Gone with the Wind is set against the backdrop of the American Civil War, presenting the passionate and tumultuous love and complex destinies of four main characters, Scarlet, Rhett Butler, Ashley, and Melanie, from the perspective of Southerners. It also reflects the collapse and disintegration of the political, cultural, and economic systems of Southern society during the war. Third, different authors express different views on the Civil War based on their respective historical perspectives, offering different angles and meanings. Comparing the portrayal of the plight of African American slaves in Uncle Tom's Cabin and Gone with the Wind allows us to have a more objective and comprehensive understanding of the issue of slavery. Fourth, the extensive dialogues among the characters in Gone with the Wind play a crucial role. They not only reflect the characters' personalities and drive the plot, but also contain a wealth of information about the historical background and social changes within their everyday conversations. The density and ambition of the novel surpass those of typical genre fiction. Fifth, Gone with the Wind is remarkably successful in character development, particularly in its portrayal of Scarlett. Scarlett evolves from a spoiled and willful Southern belle to a woman shouldering the mission of revitalizing her family. However, this resilient and upwardly striving woman becomes blindly obsessed and loves someone who is not right for her. The novel presents such a protagonist with equally prominent strengths and flaws, inviting us to savor and contemplate her character in detail. Part 2. In the first part, we summarize the storyline of Gone with the Wind. The author depicted the idyllic and prosperous life in the southern plantations before the outbreak of the Civil War. Scarlett, Ashley, and other aristocratic young men and women enjoyed a life of luxury and elegance, embodying the ideals of knights and ladies. However, the sound of war disrupted their tranquil existence as brave knights rushed off to the battlefield to serve the Confederacy. Yet, the war did not unfold as optimistically as the Southern aristocrats had imagined. The cannons of the Union Army drew near, Atlanta fell, and the defeat of the Confederate States became inevitable, shattering the ancient myths of the South. Women, too, faced hardships in the turbulent tide of war. As the war progressed, Scarlett experienced the pain of losing her husband and was trapped in Atlanta with Melanie, barely escaping death. In a critical moment, Scarlett calmly assisted Melanie in giving birth to Ashley's son. With the help of Rhett, Scarlett managed to return to the devastated Tara plantation with Melanie and her child. The suspense left at the end of the previous installment was, the war had ended, and Ashley had returned alive from the battlefield. How would Scarlett face her former love? And would Rhett, deeply infatuated with Scarlett, survive the brutal war? In the period of post-war Reconstruction, the destinies of these four individuals would once again intertwine in unforeseen ways. After the Civil War, the South quickly entered a period of Reconstruction, where various regions were in a state of disrepair. When Scarlett and her group returned to their hometown, Tara Plantation had been looted by the Union Army, losing all food, possessions, and even cotton. However, it had not been burned down, unlike neighboring plantations such as 12 Oaks and McIntosh, which had been reduced to ruins. In history, although wars are often adorned with various labels of justice or injustice, they inevitably bring about extensive suffering. Most of the plantations in the county had been burned down, and only those located away from major roads had miraculously escaped the ravages of war. Wherever the Union Army went, there were incidents of looting property and livestock and organizing the escape of black slaves. Almost all Southern slaves had been emancipated, and the surviving plantations struggled with scarcity of clothing and food. When describing the Northern troops sweeping through Southern plantations, the author pays attention to certain details. As a writer with a strong Southern sentiment, Margaret Mitchell's portrayal of the Northern soldiers harassing the Southern plantations is calm and objective. She does not depict the enemy troops from the North as irredeemable villains. In the novel, we see that the main actions of the Union Army involve burning houses and looting possessions. As for severe atrocities such as indiscriminate killings and sexual violence, they are not directly depicted in the novel. Moreover, Tara Plantation is preserved because there are sick people on the estate, and the Union Army even sends a physician to treat Scarlett's mother and her two sisters. Such reasonable conduct from the enemy is presented quite positively in the novel. Although the author's aversion towards the Northern Army is evident, they did not heavily vilify the Union soldiers when writing, but rather objectively depicted the devastation, destruction, and looting of Southern lands, plantations, and wealth by the Northern forces. The author also focused on portraying the shades of good and evil within individuals on both sides of the war. Some critics argue that Gone with the Wind takes a biased stance, excessively favoring the South and vilifying the North. However, through the aforementioned details, we can see that such claims are overly simplistic. After Scarlett returns to Tara Plantation, she also experiences looting and pillaging by the Union soldiers. The most dangerous encounter was when a Yankee bandit secretly infiltrated Tara, attempting to steal valuables and even showing inappropriate interest in Scarlett. In that moment, Scarlett's anger surged from within, and she calmly retrieved a pistol and shot the intruder in the face while he was caught off guard. This gunshot not only resolved the immediate threat to Scarlett but also served as a cathartic release, as if avenging her mother and Tara Plantation. From that point on, Scarlett no longer retreats when faced with difficult challenges. Since that day, she has completely shed the shackles of morality, and her heart has grown increasingly hardened. Moreover, this crisis brought Scarlett and Melanie together in a true sense of camaraderie for the first time. Unlike Scarlett's bold and decisive courage, Melanie displayed a steel-like tenacity and silk-like softness in the face of danger. She calmly assisted Scarlett in handling the bodies and even thought of searching the Yankees' backpack amidst the chaos, which earned Scarlett's profound respect for her. The money found on the Yankee seemed like a special blessing from God to Tara Plantation. Additionally, with the generous assistance of their neighbor, Mrs. Fontaine, who provided them with food, Tara managed to overcome the initial challenges of reconstruction. Meanwhile, under Scarlett's diligent management, the cotton fields gradually started yielding returns. Furthermore, Tara took in a soldier named Will, who became a valuable assistant to Scarlett, and Ashley's return added another labor force to the plantation. With the support of everyone, Tara Plantation began to thrive once again. As everyone enthusiastically worked to rebuild their homes, another group of invaders quietly arrived in the South. Using the book's terminology, they were referred to as a gang of scalawags, Republicans, and carpetbaggers. The scalawags were Southern whites who collaborated with the Northern government during the post-war Reconstruction period, while the Republicans were the victors from the North. Carpetbaggers were Northern politicians who came to the South with only a suitcase to profit from opportunistic ventures, similar to what we might call fly-by-night companies. The influx of these people brought about many complex social issues in the South. From the perspective of traditional Southerners, these individuals not only engaged in economic speculation and market disruption, but also incited the freed slaves to seek revenge against their former masters. This fueled the rapid growth of hatred and suspicion in a region that had been known for its harmonious master-slave relationships. These new invaders acted with impunity because they were backed by the military. After the war, Union troops were stationed throughout Georgia, and the South was under martial law. In reality, the war was far from over for the South and its people. The most brutal war, the most savage retaliation, and the most difficult aftermath had only just begun. Of course, Tara Plantation also became a target for these invaders. One day, Scarlett suddenly learned that Tara had to pay a hefty tax of $300, or else the plantation would be seized and auctioned off. Faced with this unexpected calamity, Scarlett was at a loss. The only person who could come up with such a large sum of money was Rhett Butler. Desperate, Scarlett hardened her heart and cast aside all previous constraints. She wore a dress made from her mother's velvet curtains and went to find Butler, determined not only to obtain the tax money but also to deceive him into marrying her. Ashley witnessed everything and silently blamed himself, realizing that he had pushed Scarlett to this point. He understood that Scarlett was different from him. She confronted life head-on, using her strong will to dominate it. Although Ashley returned from the war unscathed, his spiritual world had already collapsed. He knew that the pre-war life in the South, with its sculpted-like symmetry, had been shattered, and he couldn't integrate into the new post-war life, destined to be left behind. Meanwhile, Scarlett arrived in Atlanta and discovered that Butler had been imprisoned on charges of embezzling a large sum of money from the Confederate States. After much difficulty, Scarlett managed to see Butler in jail, hoping to sweet-talk him into proposing to her and providing the needed tax money. However, Butler saw through Scarlett's intentions, refused to give her the money, and even mocked her sarcastically. Angrily, Scarlett ran into Frank Kennedy, her sister Sue Ellen's fiancé, on her way out of the prison. To her surprise, Frank had opened a successful business in Atlanta and had plans to acquire a sawmill. These good news deeply stimulated Scarlett, and she saw Frank as her only lifeline. With her mind made up, Scarlett immediately discarded all moral pretenses and launched an offensive against Frank. Using her charm and a few tricks, Scarlett managed to make the normally upright Frank forget about Sue Ellen and marry her instead. Scarlett finally succeeded in saving Tara Plantation as she had wished. In Atlanta, The old customs had not completely disappeared, and Southern society began hosting parties again. Scarlett noticed that the familiar faces had lost something. Like Ashley, they still carried an air of nobility and elegance, but the hardships they had endured would remain with them for a lifetime. They had been defeated but refused to admit it, still putting on smiles to face life. Scarlett knew she was different from them. She saw through the foolish arrogance of the Southerners. At this moment, Scarlett began to identify somewhat with the values of the Northerners, that one's status was determined by wealth, not upbringing, and to be a lady, one needed money. She made up her mind to bid farewell to the old way of life and, like the Yankees, aggressively pursue wealth. In that moment, Scarlett recalled the words Rhett Butler had once said to her: "There's just as much money to be made out of the wreckage of a civilization as from the upbuilding of one." It was only now that Scarlett understood the depth of Butler's statement. She embarked on accumulating wealth during the period of civilization's destruction in Atlanta, with Frank Kennedy as her initial source of capital. With her shrewdness and competence, Scarlett quickly took over Frank's business and also borrowed money from Butler to buy the sawmill. She even pleaded with Ashley to come and help manage the sawmill. Unable to resist the emotional onslaught from Scarlett and Melanie, Ashley gave up his plans of seeking employment in the North and came to Atlanta to assist them. After the tax incident, Scarlett's obsession with money grew stronger. She became relentless in the business world, willing to do business with the despised Yankees and carpetbaggers of the traditional Southerners. She would even have tea with their wives and employed convicts at the sawmill. These unconventional actions brought dissatisfaction and resentment from the elite families of Atlanta. Though at times, Scarlett's lingering traditional values conflicted with her desire for money, in the end, the latter always prevailed. After marriage, Scarlett gave birth to a daughter for Frank, but neither family nor children could hinder Scarlett's ambition. She remained dedicated to running the sawmill, often driving her carriage alone through the dangerous black slums, a breeding ground for crime. Despite multiple warnings from those around her, Scarlett stubbornly persisted, relying on a handgun for protection. One evening, while driving alone, Scarlett was attacked by two thugs. Thanks to the intervention of the former slaves from Terra Plantation, the situation did not escalate into a disaster. However, this incident triggered a series of butterfly effects. In seeking revenge for his wife, Frank quietly joined the Ku Klux Klan and launched a raid on the slums, with Ashley also participating. However, the Northern authorities were prepared, and in the intense exchange of gunfire, Ashley was wounded, and Frank lost his life. Thanks to Butler's cover, Ashley and other Southern participants in the raid avoided arrest and imprisonment by the authorities. Although the incident seemed like a random case, it exposed a social reality: the escalating conflict between Georgia and the Northern authorities. Georgia had refused to ratify the amendment granting voting rights to African Americans, and in retaliation, the North decided to forcibly implement black suffrage in the state. To achieve their goal, the Northern authorities declared a rebellion in Georgia and imposed the harshest military control measures. In this turbulent and unstable social situation, Scarlett's attack was inevitable. The attack on Scarlett also briefly mentions the early Ku Klux Klan (KKK). When the KKK is mentioned, we immediately associate it with a group of individuals dressed in white robes, wearing hoods and pointed white hats, who commit heinous acts under the cover of darkness. However, the early KKK mentioned in the novel is not the same as the later extremist and racist terrorist organization. The original Ku Klux Klan was formed in 1866 by retired Confederate veterans from the defeated Southern Army. In its early stages, the KKK aimed to restore Democratic Party influence in the American South and opposed the federally enforced policies aimed at improving the treatment of African Americans. The novel refers to the earliest incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan. Nevertheless, it is undeniable that the author depicted the nature of the KKK in a relatively mild manner, which attracted criticism from commentators who believed that Gone with the Wind downplayed the terrifying nature of the KKK. Frank and Ashley retained the last remnants of the Southern knightly spirit. The book describes them as creating an atmosphere of protecting women, shielding them from all harsh and unsuitable things. They still carried the blood of Southern aristocracy in their veins, so risking their lives was their only way of protecting ladies. Frank's unexpected death left Scarlett widowed once again. In the midst of drowning her sorrows with alcohol, Butler came to visit and finally proposed to Scarlett. Scarlett knew that her heart belonged to Ashley, but she didn't dislike Butler either, and sometimes genuinely liked him. While Scarlett was still undecided, Butler's passionate and fiery kiss finally sealed the deal and opened Scarlett's heart. The news of their engagement naturally became a hot topic of discussion on the streets of Atlanta. The Southern aristocracy always had reservations about Butler's character, believing he was not worthy of Scarlett. From the reader's perspective, Scarlett and Butler's relationship, with its push and pull dynamics, had developed throughout most of the novel, yet they constantly played a game of you chase me, I evade you when it came to emotional attachment. Afterward, Butler's character became more rounded, especially juxtaposed with Ashley's southern fragility. Butler seemed like a wild beast. From a blockade runner during the war to a rising bourgeoisie after the war, he possessed a strong physique and a keen gaze, embodying an ambition-driven belief in the supremacy of money. It can be said that it was his subtle influence on Scarlett's values that shaped her into the strong-willed woman with a prominent female consciousness in the post-war era. These two characters shared many similarities and belonged to the strong individuals who could survive and thrive in turbulent times. Therefore, after such extensive groundwork, their union should have been a natural and logical progression. All readers could see Scarlett's flawed understanding of love, except for Scarlett herself, who remained obstinate. However, it should be noted that this deviation in perception greatly stimulated readers' sense of identification and engagement. This pattern, which originated from popular novels, is now widely used in various literary and artistic styles as an effective means to increase the relatability of works. The honeymoon trip to New Orleans brought new vitality to Scarlett, and Butler was almost completely devoted to her, willing to spare no expense. Upon returning to Atlanta, Scarlett frequently entertained the outsiders in the eyes of Southern people, Republicans, carpetbaggers, and the female companions of the renegade friends. They flocked to Scarlett's mansion to pay her visits. These behaviors deepened the dissatisfaction of the old Southern aristocrats towards her. If it weren't for Melanie's staunch defense, Scarlett would have long lost her place in Southern high society. With the birth of their daughter, Bonnie Blue, Butler shifted all his attention towards her, cherishing her as a precious gem and hoping to mold her into a Southern belle. He saw her as the first person who truly belonged to him. With Bonnie Blue's future in mind, Butler began gradually integrating into Southern social circles, toning down his arrogant and domineering personality. He aimed to please the aristocrats of Atlanta, showcasing his image as a loving father. During this time, the emotional conflict between Butler and Scarlett deepened, with the biggest source of contention between them still being Ashley. However, an unfortunate event on Ashley's birthday created an irreparable rift in their relationship. Melanie secretly organized a birthday party for Ashley, and Scarlett was ordered to delay him at the sawmill. While alone together, they couldn't help but reminisce about the past and the beautiful moments they shared. As their emotions grew intense, Scarlett's eyes welled up with tears, and Ashley tightly embraced her. Just at that moment, they were caught in an embarrassing situation by Ashley's sister. Rumors about Scarlett and Ashley instantly spread throughout the town. Kind-hearted Melanie refused to believe the gossip and warmly welcomed Scarlett at the party, taking practical actions to protect Scarlett and Ashley's reputations. However, this incident deeply wounded Butler's heart. After a heated argument that night followed by a raw emotional outburst, Butler resolutely left Atlanta with Bonnie Blue the next day. Scarlett found herself unexpectedly missing Butler. When the two reunited after a long separation, it was not a reconciliation but rather an unexpected miscarriage suffered by Scarlett. Butler was filled with regret. Before they could mend their relationship, an even greater tragedy struck. Their only bond, little Bonnie Blue, died in a horse riding accident. This became the final straw that completely shattered their marriage. From then on, Butler seemed like a different person, wearing a constant frown and appearing disheveled. His once charming demeanor had turned cold and heartless. Scarlett, too, sank into loneliness and despair. She now needed the Southern relatives she had distanced herself from, those Confederate people who had experienced war, terror, and the Great Fire with her, and had suffered the loss of loved ones. However, besides Melanie and Ashley, she received no support from anyone, leaving her in a state of deep desolation. Fate had no intention of letting Scarlett off easily, as she lost the last important person in her life, Melanie. Before her death, Melanie made Scarlett finally realize her kind and loving love for her and Ashley, as well as her unwavering support throughout. In the novel's conclusion, the author uses Melanie's death to highlight the underlying struggles in the love lives of the main characters. Their individual obsessions hindered them from finding true love. Ashley's love had always been for Melanie, and Melanie was the only unbroken dream he had in the face of harsh reality. However, he had wavered between Scarlett for years. His hypocritical sense of honor and duty prevented him from moving forward, and he found it difficult to reject Scarlett's affectionate advances. Scarlett also finally recognized Ashley's inherent weakness. He was merely an idol she had fabricated, and she was in love with the romanticized version of their relationship, not Ashley himself. The man who had been a solid shoulder for her to lean on all along was Rhett Butler. Rhett always silently loved her from the shadows, helping and understanding her in times of crisis, but she had never truly understood these two men who were the loves of her life. Although Scarlett came to understand her true feelings, Rhett believed that with Melanie's death, Scarlett could openly be with Ashley. It can be said that Melanie's death pushed their relationship to a breaking point, and everything seemed too late. After all, tomorrow is another day. Whether Scarlett can win back Rhett's heart or not, the author left an open-ended ending, allowing readers to speculate on the future fate of the two main characters. Looking back on Scarlett's journey, whenever she faced insurmountable difficulties, she would console herself with the phrase, "After all, tomorrow is another day," and eventually, the problems would be resolved. Perhaps Scarlett's final words also hinted at a more perfect outcome for this open-ended conclusion. After examining the plot of the entire novel, we deeply feel that adapting such a lengthy and intricate novel into a film while accurately preserving its essence is a challenging task. However, Hollywood in the 1930s at least achieved considerable success in commercial terms. The successful adaptation of Gone with the Wind was a product of its time. The 1930s in America was both the golden age of best-selling novels and a period of rapid development for the Hollywood film industry. The success of Gone with the Wind on the silver screen was the result of the perfect combination of timing, circumstances, and people. As mentioned in the first part, the success of the film did increase the recognition and popularity of the original novel. However, the influence of the novel was also overshadowed by the film, and the audience's perception of this classic work is often limited to the movie. Particularly in terms of plot adaptation, the film Gone with the Wind was constrained by its runtime and focused on Scarlett's love story, showcasing the grandeur of the Civil War while omitting many social background descriptions, subplots, and minor characters from the original novel. Although this did not hinder the main storyline of the novel, it did sacrifice some of its essence and depth, weakening the novel's historical backdrop and social conflicts. From a plot perspective, the film made significant changes when dealing with the cause of Scarlett's father, Gerald's death. In the novel, Gerald's death is directly related to Scarlett's sister, Sue Ellen. Sue Ellen holds a grudge against Scarlett for stealing her fiancé, Frank, and attempts to persuade their father to swear allegiance to the Confederate government in order to receive a large sum of money. Gerald regains clarity at the last moment and falls off his horse to his death while riding furiously. However, the film modified and softened the conflict of this plotline. A former white overseer named Jonas Wilkerson, who had a bad reputation, arrives at Tara with his mistress Emmy intending to buy the plantation. In a fit of anger, Gerald mounts his horse to chase after Wilkerson's carriage to teach them a lesson but tragically falls off the horse while jumping a fence. Additionally, in the novel, Scarlett has already given birth to a son and a daughter from her previous two marriages, whereas the film, to highlight the character of Bonnie Blue, changes it so that Scarlett only has one daughter with Rhett Butler. In terms of character development, the film omitted several significant characters from the novel. For example, Mrs. Fontaine, who generously provides financial aid to Tara during the Reconstruction era, and Will Benteen, a soldier taken in by Scarlett and Melanie after the war. Mrs. Fontaine is known for her sharp tongue and refreshing thoughts, with her own philosophical ideas about war and life. She doesn't hesitate to assist her neighbors in need, and as soon as she hears about Tara's food shortage, she orders Scarlett to send pork with a carriage to take away half of the food from her own plantation, helping Tara overcome its difficulties. This lady symbolizes the spirit of mutual assistance and friendship among the people of the South in the post-war era, representing the virtues that lie at the heart of Southern traditional culture. Will Benteen, a disabled soldier, is taken in by Tara and wholeheartedly helps Scarlett in revitalizing the plantation. In the end, the kind-hearted Will even marries Sue Ellen, showing his forgiveness for her mistakes. He embodies the courage, determination, and practical spirit of the post-war Southern people, who were determined to overcome difficulties and create a new life. Although the film adaptation of the novel has toned down some social background information, particularly the societal unrest caused by the post-war Northern oppression of the South during the Reconstruction era, objectively speaking, the film overall remains true to the original novel in its faithful depiction of the background, profound interpretation of the characters, and accurate expression of symbolism. The film's vibrant colors, lavish plantation scenes, epic war sequences, and appropriate casting make it a masterpiece even by today's standards, and it's no wonder that it holds an irreplaceable position in American film history. Today, rereading this classic still brings immense reading pleasure. We are not only moved by Scarlett's tumultuous love story but also gain insight into the political culture and social customs of the American South during the period of the Civil War beyond the romance. In fact, for a multicultural country like the United States, considering the racial issues presented from a different perspective in Gone with the Wind is very helpful for understanding the historical origins and complexity of the country's racial issues today. Finally, let's review the key points discussed in today's content. First, the suffering brought upon the Southern people by the war is undeniable. However, when describing the scenes of Northern troops harassing Southern plantations, the author's prose remains calm and restrained, without excessively vilifying the Union Army. This is something worth savoring as we read. Second, while the military aspect of the war has ended, with the influx of another group of invaders into the South, many problems arise in Southern society. Barbaric revenge and the difficult aftermath have just begun for the Southern people. Third, from the reader's perspective, Scarlett and Rhett's relationship evolves with a push-and-pull dynamic throughout most of the novel, and even after their marriage, they continue to play a game of cat and mouse when it comes to emotional attachment. All readers can see that Scarlett has a flawed understanding of love, but she remains stubbornly oblivious to it. However, this cognitive bias greatly enhances readers' sense of identification, and this narrative pattern, which originated from popular novels, is now widely used in various literary and artistic styles as an effective means of increasing the appeal of works. Fourth, the tragic death of their daughter Bonnie Blue becomes the final straw that shatters the relationship between Scarlett and Rhett. It is not until Melanie's deathbed that Scarlett finally realizes who she truly loves. The open-ended ending of the novel leaves readers with infinite speculation. Can Scarlett win back Rhett's heart? This creates an eternal suspense. Fifth, although the film Gone with the Wind omitted some subplots and minor characters from the original novel and weakened the historical backdrop and social conflicts, it is still an exceptional work in film history and a model of commercial success in Hollywood, with its flaws not overshadowing its brilliance. Well, that concludes the content for this episode. If you enjoyed my video, please click like, subscribe to my channel, and share it with your friends. Thank you.